Isambulivinaka, welcome to the UNESCO Masterclass series on climate change in the Pacific Islands. We invite you to join us in being curious and developing a sense of inquiry about what climate change is, all of its many dimensions, and how it affects the Pacific Islands that are among the most vulnerable communities in the world to climate change. I'm Elizabeth Holland, Professor of Climate Change and Director for the Pacific Center of the Environment and Sustainable Development, where I work with a team of awesome shining stars that you will see featured throughout this lecture series. At the end of the session, you'll be able to explain the most recent climate change findings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You'll be able to explain the climate change impacts on the Pacific Islands, and you'll be able to explain Pacific leadership towards climate solutions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a scientific body that's tasked with summarizing the evidence for climate change every 5 to 6 years. And while you may think that science is often boring, science in this case is not boring, because what we have been able to do is time after time after time, now with the 5th assessment report, we have summarized a stack of scientific literature that would stand probably 4 feet tall into one phrase: warming in the climate system is unequivocal. And that is the phrase that you most need to remember. Warming in the climate system is unequivocal. Unequivocal is an important word because it conveys a meaning that scientists almost never convey. That we know this without a doubt. That we know this from multiple lines of evidence. We know this because we've looked at the science in every possible way. This phrase summarized the 4th assessment report and now summarizes the 5th assessment report. To further elaborate that finding, and since 1950, many changes have been observed throughout the climate system that are unprecedented over decades to millennia. Unprecedented means it's never happened before for tens of years, even thousands of years. And each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. We've often, every year, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was founded in 1992, has a meeting. And now tens of thousands of people come to that meeting to negotiate the policies that should guide us towards climate solutions. What you see here by the red arrows is a few key points along this emissions pathway. And these are the times when we had particularly intense negotiations that set the trajectory for the next negotiations. On the y-axis, you see carbon dioxide emissions in gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. And along this trajectory from 1990 to 2014, you see that carbon dioxide emissions flattened a little bit after the formation of the UNFCCC, but they kept rising. Flattened a little bit after the Kyoto Protocol, meaning they slowed down a little bit after the Kyoto Protocol, but they kept rising. They slowed down with the economic slowdown, but they kept rising. So at the time the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was formed, carbon dioxide emissions were rising at 1% per year. Now, in 2013 and 2014, they are rising at 2.5% per year, 2.5 times faster than they were rising at the time we began to meet to formulate the policies for the planet to slow those emissions. The blue arrows at the bottom show the timing of the release of the 1st assessment report of the scientific information, the 2nd assessment report in 1994, the 3rd assessment report in 2001, the 4th assessment report starting in 2007,
And finally, the fifth assessment report, which is what I'm referring to in this slide and all of the slides that are particularly marked in blue. So you can see that while we identified as a global community that there was a problem with the formation of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, that policy forum has been ineffective at solving the problem that the scientific community is very clear is happening. In the Pacific Islands, the thing that will be most impactful, the thing that will impact us the most is sea level rise. And what you see here is that sea level was variable but relatively flat until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And what we see here is an increasing rise in sea level as we go through the last century and as we go into the next century. The red line will take us to a meter of sea level rise, and that will flood many of the Pacific Island countries. 1 meter of sea level rise will flood 90% of Tuvalu, shown here. On the upper left-hand panel, you see the coral atoll of Tuvalu. Here, the flat line, here is the airstrip, and this is the king tide bubbling up through that airstrip. The sea level rise we've already experienced is 20 centimeters, this much, and we're already seeing the inundations for Majuro, the Republic of the Marshall Islands. By the end of this century, we're looking at a meter of sea level rise, this much sea level rise. By the end of the next century, we're looking at 1 meter, 2 meters of sea level rise. Within 250 years, if we continue on this path, we're looking at 3 meters of sea level rise. In Tuvalu, you see that even the Funafuti, the capital of Tuvalu, is flooded at high tide. In the Marshall Islands, we see inundations time after time. The capital of the Marshall Islands has experienced 8 inundations in the last 18 months. And this is a storm that occurred in the North Pacific, sending almost tsunami-like waves to the capital itself through the lagoon to subsume this area of the Marshall Islands, of Majuro, of the area called Yenra. And the Marshall Islands presidency, the Marshall Islands foreign minister, and a remarkable poet all speak of how important these inundations are for the Marshall Islands and what the Marshall Islands will face in the future. What the fifth assessment report also demonstrates is that we're at a planetary crossroads. We can choose what planet we want to have for the next 150 years, the next 500 years, actually the next 1,000 years. The warming that we've experienced so far is 0.85 degrees centigrade. If we continue business as usual, we will continue on the red line, and we will end up at 4 to 5 degrees of warming. If we continue on the blue line, which gives us only a 66% chance of staying below the level of 2 degrees, that the global leaders have decided is the threshold for dangerous climate change. To stay below 2 degrees, we would need to peak emissions in 2020 and decrease from that peak very quickly by 50% in 2030, and then onward and onward. And by the end of this century, we will have to have found the solutions that will remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than is emitted. Those solutions don't today exist. There are a number of scientists and engineers all over the world working on this problem. But we need to be able to remove the carbon dioxide that we've emitted through fossil fuel combustion from the atmosphere to be able to prevent the planet from warming. What we see is that warming is generating droughts like we see in Aluk Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, the Pacific Island governments have asked for 1.5 degrees of warming, not 2 degrees of warming as defined by the Cancun Agreement in the COP16 a few years ago. What we see in this ring is that the difference between 2 degrees of warming and 1.5 degrees of warming. This is the level of additional risk due to climate change, and you can see that for unique and threatened ecosystems like coral reefs, we're already looking at high risks for impacts on those systems at 2 degrees of warming. And that's why the Pacific leaders are calling for 1.5 degrees of warming. So the fifth assessment report said very clearly that for 2 degrees of warming, we can only emit 850 to 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. To be able to meet the call by the Pacific leaders of 1.5 degrees of warming, we can only emit 275 gigatons of carbon dioxide still. That's how much we can still emit. What we're emitting right now is around 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. Within 8 years, we will pass the threshold of being able to meet the limit of 1.5 degrees. In another couple of decades, we will pass the threshold of being able to meet the target of 2 degrees of warming. And we have already been discussing the solutions for this problem for more than 20 years, since 1992, and it is now 2015. So we also need to understand what is happening to the carbon dioxide that we emit. As I said, we're emitting about 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year from fossil fuel combustion, additional from deforestation. But for the Pacific Islands, it's important that 26% of that carbon dioxide that we're emitting is ending up in our oceans. It is being absorbed by our oceans, it is acidifying our oceans, and it is putting our oceans in the Pacific at risk, and we are large ocean states. So if we look at the small Pacific Islands as a whole, and we wonder what are the carbon dioxide emissions for our Pacific large ocean states, we can see that our emissions are actually negative because our forests are offsetting our emissions. Our emissions are minus 8.11 gigatons of carbon dioxide at 8.11, million metric tons of carbon dioxide. So we are not the problem. The rest of the planet is creating the problem, particularly the developed world that consumes more and more fossil fuels year after year. The total Pacific Island countries and territories ocean sink, that is how much our oceans are absorbing, is 776 million metric tons per year. So our net emissions actually, in total, including our exclusive economic zones, are minus 784 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. And on today's carbon exchange, that's worth $4.7 billion. So what are the solutions? We've got mitigation, a shift to renewable energy to reduce emissions. We've got Pacific leadership committed to building a better tomorrow. We have adaptation, and we're working hard on adaptation, building climate change and disaster resilience today. Innovation, we're working hard on finding new solutions. But we do need unprecedented collaboration from around the world, from our Pacific villages to world leaders, to be able to follow the path that's set by our Pacific leaders. We're working in 15 countries throughout the Pacific to help enhance climate adaptation already. And that's with the funding of EU, with the funding of USAID, and with the funding of USAID. We see Pacific leadership emerge in the Madrid Declaration for Climate Leadership. On the left-hand side, you can see what the developed world was committing at the time of the Madrid Declaration in terms of emission reductions. We have Australia with 5% emission reductions, Canada with increasing emissions, EU with a commitment to 20 to 30% emissions reduction, now 40% emission reductions, and we see New Zealand with 5% emission reduction commitments. In the Pacific, we see the Federated States of Micronesia with a 50% decrease in imported petroleum fuel, RMI, 40% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions below 2009 by 2020, a 20% increase in efficiency improvement in transport. Solomon Islands, 100% renewable by 2050. Tuvalu, 100% renewable by 2020. PNG committed to being carbon neutral. Our leaders came together in June with the Lifu Declaration for Paris. We, the leaders, ministers, and representatives of the 15 member states and territories of Oceania 21 initiative gathered in Lifu in the presence of Australia, France, New Zealand, the European Union, and most importantly, the youth, strongly and resolutely commit ourselves to contribute to an ambitious and legally binding agreement on climate change in Paris in December of 2015. And that is the Conference of Parties 21 for Paris that will meet at the end of this year. And I would like to end by emphasizing that the ocean was given to us by our ancestors to manage so that we could pass it on to our children and future generations. It is our common responsibility and moral obligation for our children. And that is a quote from one of our leaders, Foa Toloa, the minister of Tokelau, who was also the commissioner for the Global Oceans Commission, who passed away a few months ago.
In this lecture, we've talked a lot about the science of climate change, but we know that for the Pacific, and probably for all of the indigenous cultures of the world, we can't just rely on the science, that we have to weave a sail for the future that includes the indigenous wisdom that is informed by their environment, by what we know about how the environment works with the science to be able to make a sail for the future that includes our whamakaos, our vakas, our druas, our traditional sailing boats to go forward and make sure that we have robust solutions for the Pacific and for the planet, because the solutions for the planet are likely to come from the Pacific. Nakawaka levo.